I have to be upfront about this one. Like a ton of players, the first Zelda game I ever finished from beginning to end was this one, The Wind Waker. I have a lot of genuine love for it, don't get me wrong, but I also have a lot of nostalgic love for it. I've never felt like nostalgia keeps me from getting annoyed at things personally, but then again, it's also possible that in my attempts to be open about things that bug me and don't bug me, my nostalgic bias will cause me to be too lenient or too harsh towards this game. But I suppose we'll figure out if that's the case by the end. Now, about the game itself. Released for the Gamecube in December 2002, again, very close to my birthday. The Wind Waker was the big blockbuster holiday title Nintendo was pushing that year. Zelda and Mario games always are. This one in particular was very exciting because it got to take advantage of the new console's way better hardware. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were obviously incredible games, but it was time for a big glow up, and this game set out to demonstrate what a true next-gen Zelda experience would be like, with a bigger world, better sounding CD quality audio for the music and voices, and of course, higher fidelity graphics. That would actually turn out to be a bit of a sticking point for some people because although the game pushed more polygons than before, the game adopted a radically different and simpler art style, which you can obviously see. The character designs were far more intentionally cartoony, and the game used a new technique called cell shading to add to that whole aesthetic. A lot of people complained about it at the time, saying it looked childish and even mocking the style by calling it Zelda. But does a change in character design philosophy actually weigh down a new Zelda game? How does this one stand compared to its older siblings? Let's find out in this The Wind Waker long-form review. Interesting history tidbit that I want to talk about for the last time ever in history. On the collector's edition disc, yeah, this again, there is actually a playable demo of The Wind Waker. It also has a trailer that tries to make using the grapple hook look super exciting, and it has this weird version of the Zelda main theme that I hear all the time, but I don't actually think it's used in The Wind Waker anywhere, but that's besides the point. This demo has 3 different portions from early on in the game. A dungeon section in Dragon Roost Caverns, a stealth section in Forsaken Fortress, and an island portion where you can run around Windfall Island and Dragon Roost Island, as well as sail between them. After 20 minutes of any of these sections, the game will abruptly fade to white and then reset the entire disc. There's not really anything notable about this as a game, but as a piece of game promotion, I think it's kind of fascinating. Like, I'm sure we've all played plenty of game demos in our time because they're very useful tools publishers can use to help convey their game's whole deal. In fact, I'd argue it's even probably the best thing you can do for any game. Nowadays, all demos for new games are distributed digitally, but at this point in game history, demo discs had become and stayed the norm for the better part of a decade. So just the fact that they're so outdated now makes them such an interesting thing to dig into and behold. I might even start trying to collect some demo discs for my PS2. Really, I'm that interested in it. But with all of that being said, we've now covered all of the relevant content contained on the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition disc. It's certainly played a big part in these last few videos, so I'm eternally thankful for it, and I think it's probably one of my favorite parts of my game collection. Bon voyage, amigo. May you rest in peace until I play Ocarina of Time again. Okay, now it's time to switch over to my regular old Wind Waker disc. Let's get going. I forgot I named an old file that, oh my gosh. Well, I guess I better lean into it then. Okay. Say hello to bitch, all caps. Okay, now we can get going for real. The game opens with an iconic summary of the Hero of Time's legacy. The style used to represent the events that happened is really awesome, and the music that accompanies it is perfect, using the most old-timey instruments imaginable to paint this as a sacred part of history for whoever is narrating it to us. We never find out who that is, meaning this is a totally non-diegetic narration, but that's fine. It sets up this game's connection to Ocarina of Time effectively, states that all those events happened a billion years ago, and then sets up our current setting. An island where the boys coming of age dress up like the Hero of Time in an attempt to have them learn courage. The actual game part begins on this very island named Outset Island, which even for a Nintendo game is a very on-the-nose name. This noisy little girl climbs up onto a lookout post where this game's version of Link is lying passed out after partying a little too hard last night. I don't know what is he doing there. Also, I'm immediately gratified by naming Link bitch. There's never a single point in the entire game where I regretted that. Evidently, today is his birthday. Link is first tasked with walking over to his grandma's house, which launches us into the tutorial section of the game. Yay. Outset Island isn't really that big. You can move back and forth across it in about a minute. This part of it isn't awful because most of the people teaching you stuff can only tell you about actions you can do, and even then only when prompted. This guy says you can find treasure in the grass. This kid asks Link if it's true you can jump over gaps. Spoiler alert, it is. This guy explains you can crawl to snatch up these pigs, which is a fun side activity you can do in this part of the game. And the pot lady, who is the best character in the game, explains that her job is actually worthless because anybody can do what she does by pressing a button. Based. The only exception to this is the guy that yells at you to get you to L-target him. But L-targeting is honestly more in need of explanation than the movement-based mechanics, so I'll let it slide, even though he made me drop my pig. I wanted to go to the big pig jamboree, you freaking flower horn-looking son of a fish. All these characters basically do the same things as their counterparts from Ocarina of Time, but I'd argue this game does the same setup better because all the characters look different. They all contextualize their actions in more appealing ways. You can even go into a couple houses and have some fun optional interactions, and overall I'd even say that Outset Island has a more easily traversable layout than Kokiri Forest as well. Plus, although they share musical ideas, I think the music for Outset is better too. After you're done faffing about, you can visit your grandma's house and get given the hero's clothes. Now, with this whole coming of age thing being at the center of this celebration, I got curious as to how old Link actually is in the game. They say he's the same age as the legendary hero, but with how the story of Ocarina of Time played out, that would put this kid at either 10 or 17, I think. However, I realized this idiot is in Smash, so I did some digging, and according to the Brawl Trophy description, his green clothes were worn on his 12th birthday and are the lucky outfit of the hero of legend. So evidently, not only is this Link's 12th birthday, this is also the Hylian equivalent of a bat mitzvah. Think about it. After this, you begin really getting railed with tutorial stuff because Auril, Link's little sister from earlier, gives you the telescope as an item, which forces the player to learn how to equip and use items, but once you complete a scripted sequence with the telescope, an unnamed girl gets dropped into a forest, giving you a reason to finally go and learn how to do the classic sword combat. This tutorial is pretty okay. I like the music that drives it, and I like how Orca slaps you when you mess up. But it's pretty clear from this tutorial that combat may be a bit smoother and have some new bells and whistles, but it's still pretty much the same as the previous two games. After this, you go to the forest, face off with a few enemies in an unprotected environment, and then your sister gets kidnapped by the giant bird. This is one of the few times an out-of-the-blue moment really works story-wise, because otherwise Link wouldn't have an impetus to leave the island on a quest, and Tetra, the pirate captain, wouldn't have a good reason to get called out by the Rito postman. As a result of being called out, she feels indebted to Link and also begins her character arc as a result. This also sets up the heartbreaking scene where Link's grandma is suffering from severe depression later in the game, since both of her grandchildren essentially get ripped away from her in an afternoon. But all of this leads to Link's departure, which is a very heartwarming scene I always look forward to watching. It's so well directed. You feel the sappy melancholy Link does as he leaves his home behind, before Tetra cuts the music off and the pirate theme kicks in alongside her smug posing. Nothing that happens on the pirate ship really matters. Out of the pirate crew, Tetra is really the only character I like. Nico is excessively annoying to me, and at any rate, the player could probably have figured out how to swing on ropes on their own. It's really not that hard. This whole challenge was just made to fill up time. After getting launched in one of the funniest scenes in any Zelda game, the player must sneak through Forsaken Fortress. It's kind of weird having the stealth section this early in the game, but I'm honestly happy about it because it makes it easier than it would have been later on. Something that's always annoyed me is that with the symmetrical layout of the top floor, you'd think both directions would be equally challenging, but heading towards the tower from the left is far more difficult than coming around from the right, and I find that kind of strange. Both sides of this room should have had 2 moblins to sneak past, but coming in from the right only has 1. Also, I got busted one time because a rat knocked me out of a barrel, so that's awesome. I have a surprising lack of anything to say about this section. You would think losing the sword early on and having to sneak through the fortress would make the situation more tense, but really this section's just kind of boring. After getting to the top and recovering your sword though, Link thinks he's about to save Auril before the bird from earlier snatches him and takes him to the top of the fortress where Ganondorf is teased as the main villain. After getting tossed out to sea, Link then awakens to discover he's been rescued by the King of Red Lions, who is a talking boat. The King of Red Lions explains that Ganon is in fact the one in charge of the fortress, so we need to try and retrieve a magic weapon to stop Ganon and save Auril. I personally really dislike the King of Red Lions during the first half of the game. He doesn't interrupt you barely ever while you're out exploring, but when he does talk, he always talks down to you, which is kind of in character for who he turns out to be later, but as a boat, he just looks too stupid to earn that. I will say that after the reveal of his true identity later, I started to warm up to him, but he just barks orders at you the second he meets you, and that's a rough introduction for sure. Eiji Aonuma, producer of the Zelda series at this point, personally wrote this character's dialogue because at the time he was expecting a son in his family, and he wanted to write dialogue that felt like fatherly advice. I do not think he succeeded, but that's kinda cute at least. Anyways, after freaking around on Windfall and finding a sail, you can sail over to Dragon Roost Island. I'll save my thoughts on sailing for the section where I talk about the Great Sea, but now we are done with the opening of this game. I could easily say that this opening is worse than Majora's Mask simply because it's way more linear and more hands-on, honestly even more so than Ocarina of Time's was now that I'm thinking about it. But I don't think it's worse than either of those games. We're on new hardware now, so there's going to be a new controller and gameplay tweaks to get used to, no matter how experienced you are with Zelda gameplay. Plus the world and story of the Wind Waker are way bigger in scope than either of the previous 2 games, but within an hour and a half, the game has gotten the gist of its story across anyway. Link must cross the Great Sea to stop Ganon and save his sister. Even if Nico's challenge sucks, and even if Forsaken Fortress is boring as flip, there's a lot of gameplay variety here and a lot of charming moments. Link's item beholding being a subtle fourth wall break twice, and getting launched out of the barrel are just 2 small examples of how charming this game is in its opening moments. So it could have been a bit more brief, but honestly, it's only the first hour of a much larger game that needed to get across a grander world and story premise on bigger hardware, so I'll just move on and say it's good enough for what it is. But we can obviously see that Link as a player character has plenty of tweaks we need to go over. The Great Sea is definitely a new approach to Zelda's overworld design that I really want to talk about. We need to dive into this game's dungeons. More on that later. The story obviously has more to it this time. The everything about the presentation is better now, so I want to give it its time to shine. And yeah, I think that's it. Okay, let's dive in. What's the Wind Waker's whole deal? What makes it tick? Finally, a game built with the GameCube controller in mind. The control stick is able to move more fluidly, the buttons are all in the right places, it just seems tailor-made for a new 3D Zelda game. The large A button makes it easy to perform context-sensitive actions, the B button is easy to mash for all your sword attacks, and the X, Y, and Z buttons are in the perfect positions to make your items accessible. And we have a controllable camera bound to the C stick this time. I can't tell you how many times that came in handy. It's just so nice that that's finally in a Zelda game. Pretty much the only questionable controls are the shoulder buttons. I actually don't like the squishy GameCube shoulder buttons because after playing for long enough, they actually start to make my fingers sore. So you can probably imagine that my left index finger was on fire after playing this game. On the whole though, the controller is well laid out and is mostly comfortable to play. Link himself is a lot more agile and snappy compared to previously. There were times he retained that weight from the N64 games that makes it easy to get stuck on corners and such, but there weren't many times that I was really annoyed with him. His roll is faster, making getting from point A to B even more of a cinch, and combat even moves at a snappier pace. Not only do the basic attacks have faster animations, there's also been parry attacks added that make hard to deal with enemies not hard to deal with in a flashy way. Not that it gets more complicated than that at any point, but it's a small step towards making 3D Zelda combat more engaging. I really like how all the items have decent use in combat to some extent too. It really makes Link's moveset feel more organic and real, since you can use pretty much everything you have at any time. The only thing that doesn't quite work is the first person aiming still. It's definitely getting better every time, but I still found it to be really touchy and difficult to get right. On that note, I guess let's just dive into all the items. There are a lot of returning items in the Wind Waker, and some of them function the same as previously, although some get nice upgrades. The power bracelets fill in for the gauntlets from Ocarina of Time, and now in addition to pushing big blocks, you can now lift giant rocks and toss them into the wall. I kinda wish this was used to actually carry stuff in the game, but whatever. The iron boots function identically to before, however they are now equipped to a button instead of the menu, saving a lot of time. The boomerang now locks on to up to 5 targets at a time and actually tells you when you're aiming at something, which is awesome. It's actually like fun to use now. The bow with regular fire, ice, and light arrows returns, and you can switch between arrows with a button press, so you don't have to equip those separately anymore, which is also awesome. Other returning items are the bombs, hammer, hookshot, and bottles, and they all function pretty much identically to how they did previously. The hammer is technically kind of different because now you get to use it to slap these Mario-esque buttons into the ground, but it's the hammer. Literally, who gives a shit about the hammer? There are 2 wholly new items in this game, the grapple hook and the Deku Leaf. The grapple hook can be used as a make-your-own rope. In the GameCube version, the animation that plays when you latch onto something takes forever to play, and swinging isn't a very unique or novel or even fun action to do, especially because the hookshot's also in this game. This item blows. The Deku Leaf is much better. If you're on the ground, you can blow a powerful burst of air straight in front of you. If you jump off a ledge and pull it out, however, you can use it to glide through the air. I really enjoy the Deku Leaf since the gliding can be enjoyably tricky and therefore rewarding to pull off, but its use falls off in the second half of the game, which is really disappointing. The final new items are the bags. You get the spoils bag to hold things that enemies drop, and those are used for side quests or potion making. You get the bait bag to hold fish bait or hoi pairs, which is, well, that bag is whatever. And then the delivery bag holds all sorts of one-time use items. These are cute ways to technically increase the amount of items in the game without cluttering up the screen. Oh, and there's also totally useless garbage. The telescope, well, wait, let's make sure Ariel doesn't hear this, poor girl. The telescope is literally a nothing item, and it is only necessary for this scripted sequence at the start of the game, right after she gives it to you. Then the Tingle Tuner is something that I can't really comment on, because I don't have a GBA to hook up to my Wii, but it's never required for anything, thank God. I'm sure that if I was able to use this when I was a kid, I would have thought it was crazy cool using 2 game machines at the same time. Nowadays though, the thought makes my head melt from the thought of crossing all those wires and making my room explode. The item selection in this game is alright. There are some items like bombs and arrows and the hookshot that don't need a lot of tweaking to be considered great. There's a reason they always come back. But it's a shame that there's only a few new items in this game, and they range from shit to good but underutilized. There are some neat ideas like the bags and the gliding of the Deku Leaf that I think should return in the future, so I guess we'll just have to see how that goes. In the meantime though, I think we should take a beat to discuss the musical instrument in this game. The titular Wind Waker is actually a conductor's baton that allows you to borrow the power of the gods according to the game. The main deal with this thing is that instead of playing notes, you're conducting an invisible choir, so you have to perform your notes to the beat of the metronome at the top of the screen. If that sounds more complicated, that's because it is. This is definitely a more difficult concept to wrap your head around compared to playing the ocarina. I struggled with using the Wind Waker a lot at first when I first played this game. Once you do get the hang of it though, I think it's fine enough. Although I don't know how actually necessary it is. I don't really like how you have to play the songs at the game's pace, but since we're conducting in a time signature, I do like that you have the ability to conduct in 3/4, 4/4, or 6/4 time. The actual songs you play on this thing are kind of lame though. The Wind's Requiem allows Link to change the direction of the wind, so you can always be sailing with the wind to your back. The Song of Passing is just the sun's song, changing night to day and day to night whenever you want. The command melody can only be used when you're in a dungeon with a partner, and it allows you to swap over to them and use their abilities, so it's a cute gimmick whenever you're forced to use it, I guess. The Ballad of Gales allows you to warp to specific points on the map using a huge tornado. This is extremely helpful. The only other songs, the Earth God's Lyric and the Wind God's Aria, are used to get Medley and Makar to join you for their specific dungeons, and to blow up these huge stone slabs in their specific dungeons. Those ones are pretty cool because they're actually different parts of the main theme of the game. However, none of the other songs are actual full-length tracks besides the Song of Passing, which is just the sun song again, so they really aren't very memorable. The Wind's Requiem and Ballad of Gales do have nice little jingles that play whenever you use them, but those aren't actual songs. Part of what made the songs in the N64 games so memorable was that they were actually taught to you as songs. They even had little music videos to go with them and everything, and sometimes they were based on full-fledged themes from elsewhere in the soundtrack. Sure, Link's little animations for each song are really charming, but spoiler alert, all the animations are charming. I'm just really let down that these tunes aren't really all that memorable compared to the previous two games. This might seem like a weird thing to go off about, but I'm just really let down that these tunes aren't all that memorable compared to the previous two games, especially the Wind's Requiem. You'll be hearing that by far the most out on the ocean to change the wind direction, and it's really just in one ear and out the other musically. It should have been given more prominence somehow. There was a lot that already happened in the beginning section of the game, so if your short-term memory loss is already kicked in, I guess go back 15 minutes. The most important part for now is that to save Aryll, we need to go to different major islands to get sacred pearls. The first two are pretty standard by Zelda conventions. Link shows up, gets involved with the problem the natives are facing, helps out by beating a boss in a dungeon, gets a pearl, and leaves. When the time comes to go to the third island and get the third pearl, it turns out Ganon has already blown it to freaking smithereens. The Rito Roast Master drops in and tells Link that Jaboon, the spirit with the third pearl, has actually fled to Outset Island. However, the pirates also know about this and are doing something fishy on Windfall after trying to break into where Jaboon is. On top of all this, a curse comes over the sea where an everlasting night and thunderstorm come over the entire ocean and won't let up. Thanks, Dingledorf. Link goes to Windfall where it turns out the pirates are stealing bombs, and Tetra notices Link hiding above them. Fearing that Outset Island could also get exploded, she decides to stay and party for the night. This allows Link to go steal some bombs from the pirate ship, although Tetra warns him that they'll be roaring past him in the morning, but who cares? We know this curse ain't ending anytime soon. Back on Outset Island, you can cure your depressed grandma's abandonment complex to get soup, and then blast open Jaboon's cave so you can just get the third pearl? Weird. After this, Link puts the pearls in these Pikmin referencing statues on the 3 tiny triangle isles, and the Tower of the Gods rises up out of the sea. After passing this huge test, Link is then taken underwater where it turns out Hyrule is being preserved in some sort of weird underwater seal. Time is frozen here, basically, but once Link obtains the Master Sword, the world becomes unfrozen. Link leaves the castle though and storms Forsaken Fortress. He's able to save his sister, but Tetra helps out by taking the girls to the ship so Link can finish things off with the giant bird from earlier. Link beats the shit out of the dumb, idiot, stupid bird and then goes to confront Ganondorf. Unfortunately, the Master Sword is kind of out of power, and pulling it actually restored Ganondorf's true power, so he beats the snot out of Link. Tetra comes back and tries to help, but they end up getting saved by the Rito, and the dragon from Dragon Roost burns Ganondorf's room to ashes. Link and Tetra go to Hyrule again, and it's revealed that the King of Red Lions is actually the ghost of the King of Hyrule, Daphnius Nohansen Hyrule. Personally, I'm kind of surprised that's actually his last name, but Zelda lore doesn't matter. He explains to the kids that this ancient kingdom is actually the ancient kingdom, like of legend or whatever, and that all the islands are actually the mountaintops of this world that became islands when the gods flooded the world to stop Ganon a billion years ago. He furthermore reveals that Tetra is actually Princess Zelda, and then tells her to stay here and not get kidnapped. Good girl. Link has to go above the waves and go find the Earth and Wind temples. Both of these places were kept by sages, a Zora and a Kokiri respectively, but they got murdered. So now Link needs to find their descendants to be the new sages. These turn out to be my girl Medli and Makar, who were characters we met earlier when we visited the first couple islands. At the end of their dungeons, they both begin praying for the Master Sword's power to return, which works. This is the main chunk of the middle part of the story. I know what you're thinking if you played the game. I mean, aren't you forgetting about the Triforce quest? Trust me, we'll get there. I think the first chapter of this game is really nice. The game taking place on the ocean and serving as a sequel to Ocarina of Time is done well. You get to meet new races that have their own way of living on the diverse islands. I like that when you meet the spirits of the old days, they speak Hylian at you. I also like that you meet the new sages relatively early on, and that they play a significant role in the first 2 dungeons. This part of the story may be the most standard, but it's done exceptionally well for what it is. Greyfish Isle and the subsequent bomb heists are also really fun to play through, since you get to meet the pirates again, albeit from afar, and then return to Outset Island and catch up with people if you want. The idea of the Great Sea being cursed at this point as Ganondorf tries to prevent you from getting the last pearl is interesting too, though structurally you would think catching up with Jaboon would create access to another dungeon somehow. The whole middle section with tons of story happenings is pretty awesome and begins the second chapter of the game. With the rail saved, now the stakes are raised and Link is tasked with truly becoming Hyrule's next hero, but we also get to see Ganondorf return and be just as menacing as last time. I do have to wonder though, because if he knew the Master Sword couldn't take him out yet, why did he even bother cursing the Great Sea earlier? I guess he was just planning on getting the Triforce of Wisdom and taking over Hyrule on his own? I mean, that's why he was kidnapping all those girls after all. Well, whatever. Killing that dumbass bird is the most satisfying end to the first part of the game's story that I could hope for, and Ganondorf being fully in the picture raises the stakes for this doofier version of Link. The reveal that Tetra is Zelda is kinda dumb. I think most people think that. A lot of players probably figured out she was Zelda way before Tetra did, and her chic-esque color palette wasn't doing her any favors. But from a writing perspective, it also comes across as though she gets taken over by the character of Zelda, which apparently means she immediately loses any of her snark and starts acting all bland and proper. I think the intention was that she was so taken aback by her lineage that she was speaking in a more reserved manner, but that also doesn't really work. Plus, I'm not sure how to feel about her immediately losing her tan and becoming super pale. That just doesn't sit right with me. This twist could have been handled far better in multiple ways. Zelda's lullaby doesn't even sound that appealing in this game anyways. The second section back above the sea is less great from a storytelling perspective. Meeting the dead sages should be awesome because they're throwbacks to the Zoras and Kokiri, but that also makes the new creatures strange because you would think the Zoras would still be around. And there's no way the Kokiri would just turn from humanoid creatures into little wood block things with leaf faces. But it's also less interesting because they just dump some exposition on you and then vanish. Both of their dialogues are basically, oh, I got killed by Ganon's squad, go find the person that has the same instrument I do and then you can go to the next dungeon, woo. However, catching back up with Medli is awesome because Medli is awesome. She's super sweet, but has this weird sense of imposter syndrome that I can really relate to. Her more mild-mannered personality makes her stick out from previous Sage characters, and her appearance is just really well done. She looks cute and reserved without looking like the designers were trying too hard. Seeing her want to take on her responsibility but not hurt Prince Kamali's feelings is really sad. It's got a nice little remix of Dragon Roost Island to drive home the melancholy too. Basically, she's the second best character in the game after the Pot Lady, who has also become the #1 best character in the entire Zelda series because she's the Pot Lady, fight me. Meeting up with Makar is stupid because Makar is stupid. That's right guys, I told you it was coming and I promised it was coming. It's time for the iconic fuck Makar rant. Makar is literally a burden in this game in every way. You do the Forbidden Woods because he's an idiot who flew too close and fell in. I mean, sure, he can fly, but he literally doesn't bother getting himself out. Instead, he gets eaten by the most obviously predatory plant in the whole place. And his personality is literally more boring than the wood on his body. He sucks to control in the Wind Temple because his mid-air flying control is nothing. And his special ability is planting trees. Oh wow, that's awesome, that's so cool. When he awakens as a sage, he just says, oh wow, I just realized I'm the Wind Sage. He doesn't get sad because he cares about nobody and nobody cares about him. The team had no ideas for him as a character, and this little blob that's supposed to be a charming little guy is just a nothing, blank slate that sucks at everything he's made to do. This has been the Fuck Makar rant. Subscribe. Anyways, these two dungeons are pretty cool, but it feels like there was supposed to be a little bit more to it. I don't know who would have been a third sage if that's what they were planning, maybe Yril or Nico. Or maybe there was another section planned out for more dungeons, but with the Master Sword powered up, it feels like it's time to go deal with Ganondorf, right? Right? Nuh-uh, go hunt on the sea for 8 charts and 8 Triforce bits, you stupid kid. This section screams terrible improv on the part of the team. I'll elaborate on this later, but we know for a fact some dungeons were cut, so this part of the game and story feel rushed. Once you finish the Wind Temple, the King of Red Lions literally just says you need to go find the pieces of the Triforce to go back below the waves. They do try to give it some stakes because a fish tells the king that Ganondorf has totally vacated the Forsaken Fortress, which the king surmises means he's probably on the move. They do also try to foreshadow the Triforce hunt earlier in the story before the Earth Temple because the King of Red Lions tells you about it right after you leave Zelda. But since your mind is on the dungeons and sages, this comes out of nowhere and then gets dropped faster than a bomb in Dragon Roost Caverns. Now can I get a rim shot there? Thank you. Then after the Wind Temple, he just brings it back up, and then the story stops until you finish the quest. This is a total pace killer in what has mostly been a pretty rapid-fire linear Zelda story. It makes the whole thing smash the brakes and probably flip the car. It does pick up again at the ending, but for the next 5 to 10 hours, the story does not matter. The stakes of Ganon is gone, so he's probably in Hyrule. I mean, they don't matter when you can only get the shards so quickly because you have to buy a cabana from a school teacher. I do find the big ideas of the story to be good food for thought, though. A big thematic through line in this story that I really enjoy is a focus on keeping the past alive versus moving towards the future. The reveal of Hyrule still being around despite having faded into post-submersion, Tetra actually being a more traditional Zelda, Ganondorf returning and searching for the Triforce again, the dead sages still being a Zora and Kokiri. All of these things show various connections to Ocarina of Time, but they're shown to be of the past. For all intents and purposes, most of the characters we meet and places we visit on this journey are totally removed from that world. In that sense, the Rito and Korax could represent this theme by being totally different from what came in the past, and in that light, I'm more than okay with their inclusion. Now, does the inclusion of characters, plot elements, and visual references diminish the enjoyment of Ocarina of Time's or the Wind Waker's stories? This will vary from player to player, but personally, no it doesn't. The King of Hyrule is a new character to us, and although Tetra turning into Zelda is disappointing, it was more than likely that Zelda would return as a character in this story, same with Ganondorf. This story is structured so that Ganondorf is still given plenty of excellent sinister build-up and becomes even more of a threat for the second half of the game. If there's any other references, they're done subtly enough, like the stained glass of the sages in the Master Sword Chamber. For the most part though, the imagery of the ocean and the new races and characters keep this story and setting from feeling anywhere close to remotely samey. I'm kinda glad there weren't substantial sections where you traverse Hyrule below the sea, because that would have kind of undone the ethereal quality that a kingdom frozen in time under the sea would have. Really the only awful part is the Zelda Tetra twist. A couple other details I actually really like are that Hylian is portrayed as an ancient language in this story, showing that Ocarina of Time's events really did happen like a billion years ago. Same with the Hero of Time, because the King of Red Lion states that this Link has no connection to him. Ganondorf later assumes that this Link is actually still the Hero of Time, which greatly sets up a contrast between these two ultimately similar characters. We'll get into the game's ultimate message later on, but just keep these big ideas in your brain for now. Yeah, just tuck it in there. Thanks. This game's approach to overworld design is totally different from either of the previous two games. Instead of a huge interconnected grassy kingdom, this game takes place on the Great Sea. You need to sail across it and travel to a bunch of scattered islands to discover all sorts of things across this uncharted 7x7 grid of a blue mass. So, first things first, how does the boat control? I really like it. I wish it was a lot faster, but on a base level, controlling the boat as you glide across the water is really satisfying. Controlling the cannon is awful though, to be honest. In the remake they added a reticle, so that's an improvement, but in this version it's pure pain. Using the grapple hook isn't good or bad, it's just there and functional, although sometimes the animation goes on for too long. I found the standard animation time to be a good fit that I never minded, but anything longer than that was wicked boring. Since the main way you'll be getting around is by sailing, the team chose to make wind direction a big mechanic, and you can manipulate it using the Wind Waker. It does get annoying because you can't sail against the wind, obviously, so you'll have to play the wind's requiem every time you need to change it. When sailing slightly out of the wind's direction, you'll be sailing even more slowly than usual, and when you're totally against it, you'll come to a complete stop. so the wind direction becomes a really tedious mechanic to deal with the longer the game goes on. At about the halfway point of the game, you'll get the Ballad of Gales, which you can use to warp to 9 key islands. I think all the points are well placed except for the Mother and Child Isles one. It warps you into the inner wall of the island, which you need to use to get the fire and ice arrows. That's fine, I really like that puzzle, but as a warp point, that top corner will be really helpful to pop over to, and you just can't. This island should have been swapped for something like Tingle Island or something. Speaking of island placement, you have your main sea chart, but you'll also get a bunch of other sea charts that will help you find treasures near specific islands, locations of fairy isles, where all the big octos are, that sort of thing. Those ones you'll have to discover through various means, although some characters will mail them to you. With the main chart though, it starts out totally empty and you'll have to chart it. You can chart an island by tossing some bait at these talking fish by each island. They'll give you some info and add the island to the chart. It's a cute idea, but so many of the things they choose to tell you aren't very useful. Neither is the sea chart itself. Most of the islands aren't able to be seen on the full chart without zooming in, so it's hard to memorize the visual top-down layout of the sea when you're going back for secrets. All you can see are the bigger, major islands, and which sector you're in and which direction you're facing. When you head into a new sector, or even when you're returning to the smaller islands, you're constantly going to be popping open your charts to check if you're even heading in the right direction, and even then you'll have to rely on tiny little silhouettes in the distance to make sure you're actually headed for the island. Not the best system. When you're sailing between islands, you'll come across a bunch of different distractions. You can take on the sea platforms, enter submarines, avoid stupid enemies that are very unlikely to hit you ever, even when you stand still for a long time. There are the simple big octo fights, and there are rings where you can fish for treasure. There is plenty to do out on the ocean. It's just easy to scrutinize or get tired of all of this because a lot of it is repeated content. Every platform and submarine is just a small enemy gauntlet. Every big octo fight is a boomerang fest. If you fish for treasure, you could get a heart piece, but more often you'll just get 20 or 50 rupees. And before you upgrade your wallet, that's pretty disheartening because you may not be able to even carry it, and after you upgrade your wallet, it's disheartening because it's so small. And with all these activities being so mid, it falls to the islands themselves to carry most of the load. Unfortunately, most of them aren't up to snuff either. A lot of these items are straight shots when you have the right items, and a lot of them don't have significant amounts of content to truly make them memorable. A lot of them just look the same. Some palm trees, grass, maybe a pool. There's not a lot to make them visitable. The ones you have to visit to finish the game certainly stick out, but many of them reuse assets and are just a different shape from the others. They're technically different, but not significantly different. The ones you do have to visit are fun to explore, but since they're tiny islands, they don't take very long to totally plunder. The main ones, Outset, Dragon Roost, Windfall, and Forest Haven, are the only ones I consider truly substantial in that regard. You come for a meaty story segment, and they have plenty of side areas and quests to take on top of that, so you'll be revisiting them a lot. All the other ones, Fire Mountain, Ice Ring Isle, Birds Rock Peak, Diamond Step, Steel Islet, etc. are get in, get out affairs. Good for what they are, but you won't be visiting them for long. And all the others are even less interesting, offering at most a secret cave you don't need to do. Some islands are literally just mini-games. Some of them give bottles and pieces of heart, but they don't really have that fun factor that the ones in the last two games did. I really didn't bother doing a lot of the side quests during my playthrough. The ones I did were kind of charming, but they were honestly nothing when compared to how great the quests were in the previous two games, especially Majora's Mask. Even the idea of some of these, like the Nintendo Gallery or the Trading Quest, really made me stressed from just thinking about them, so I just skipped them in their entirety. I think that really shows in my playtime. Here, look, both of the N64 games' footage playthroughs were split into 20 parts. This game only has 14 parts. This game doesn't give a great incentive to stop and do everything in it. And again, it gets even worse during the Triforce hunt. Using the incredible chart, you need to go to islands marked down to find the 8 Triforce charts, and then go to Tingle to pay 398 rupees to decipher each chart, then use each of those charts to go fish up 8 Triforce shards. It's about as interesting as it sounds, although I will admit it gets better as it goes on and isn't actually that bad in the first half. The objectives like getting the Cabana Deed, hunting down the very disappointing ghost ship, and doing the stupid seagull controlling thing with the switches suck. Tingle extorting you stinks unless you come prepared, which you know I did. But finishing up the Triforce shards doesn't take too long. I think more than anything, this quest is mostly the worst for newbies. If this is your first time, this will probably really infuriate you if you try to do it without a guide. If you're experienced, you can speed through most of the annoying parts. Either way, I will still stand by the fact that this is a huge pace killer for what was a very brisk, mostly linear adventure. The amount of warping, wind waking, and water crafting you do while looking for the shards also did make me start to get tired of sailing. If this quest actively pisses you off, I honestly can totally empathize with you. But when you know it's coming, it's honestly not too bad if you just sit down and plan out your path. That all being said, I've been fairly down on the ocean, as most people are, but I think I can imagine far better ways to handle a lot of these issues, or at least things that would make the package a lot better for me. 1. Turn the Wind Waker into an item that doesn't make you need to play the songs. Not every Zelda game needs to be about an instrument, and even though I like the conductor baton concept, in practice it's kind of boring, gets used way too often, and is the least memorable part of its own game. Just make it a magic compass or something that gets used differently in different situations. Make it like the boat where you can switch between uses and then just push a button and bam, you switch the wind direction instantly. Bam, you open the warp menu. Bam, you control another character. The only problem this would create is changing the sage songs, but honestly just turn that into a button prompt. Nobody's gonna cry if they can't play a song and make a rock blow up. 2. Give the King of Red Lions some upgrades, better battle capabilities, faster sailing speed, and even wind direction resistance. We see more powerful ships, better sails, and even steam engines on other vessels throughout the game. I think upgrades like these would be even better rewards for the side quests that already exist, or even different ones. 3 and 4, they kind of go together, smash the islands together and make charting a more active process. I think we can all agree that constantly sitting and staring while you sail in one direction for 4 to 5 minutes at minimum should be cut out somehow. A lot of these islands aren't worth it anyway, so if a lot of these disjointed concepts were put together as part of a larger island, you'd have more of a reason to revisit or stay and poke around. For example, if the Golf Course Island, Seagull Island, and Cube Islands were all put together, there'd be a ton of content right there. Plus, with less islands, they could make each one more aesthetically distinct. This would also make warping around and looking for side quests a lot more tolerable, and you would be able to see everything on the chart because they take up enough space. On top of this, if you get rid of the fish guy, you can make climbing onto the island and taking a look around the way that islands get added to your map. Maybe there's a character you meet on the island or some sort of left behind charting log you get info from. Maybe you climb to a key point on the island. Either way, I would encourage you to get out of the boat and take a look around to fill your chart. This would obviously diminish the fish's role, but honestly you could make him a Zora or just make him totally optional and it wouldn't matter. 5. Make the sea chart markable. Let people mark places they want to revisit and chart a course. You could add stickers, color code tiles, the whole shebang. That would make me actually want to revisit some islands and would make travel so much less cumbersome when you get rid of short-term memorization. I'm surprised that this wasn't included, or even that the HD version didn't add it. And 6, the Triforce quest should have been a dungeon. You could make this quest more tolerable by tweaking it the way the HD version did, where you only need 3 charts deciphered and a lot of the objectives just give you a Triforce shard. But wouldn't it just be cooler if finding the shards was part of some dungeon? Yeah, that's what I thought. With all those big changes being said, I don't mind the ocean the way it is. For the most part, the sailing and atmosphere is enough for me. I don't mind sitting back and just taking it all in. That's definitely my bias for ocean settings sitting in. Again, if you hate this, you're totally valid. I mean, I just spent like 10 pages complaining and tweaking ideas about this thing, but I don't know, I still just like it. A lot of Nintendo games in general have this issue where the basic things are perfected, but the big picture picture starts to get blurry the more you spend time with their games. This game is a prime example of that. I love sailing and I wouldn't lose it for anything, but the actual things the game gives you to sail for are less than desirable. The dungeons in this game all have a lot of similar problems. They're all pretty linear, none of the puzzles are that complicated or interesting, and although they have some interesting aesthetics, they're a lot less standout when you compare them to dungeons we've seen in the last few years. Obviously, there are more than a few things I can say about them all individually, but the thing is, this section probably won't be as positive as the dungeon sections in the previous two videos were. I guess we should just get this over with then, so let's start with... This dungeon takes place in a volcano, but it also takes place around the outside of the volcano on top of Dragon Roost Island. I'll give this one a pass for how linear it is since it's the very first dungeon. Plus, I will say that switching between rooms lit up by lava, caves, and the outside of the mountain really provides a lot of visual variety. This could have been used more effectively in a more non-linear dungeon since these different color palettes definitely would have helped with spatial memorization, but considering this dungeon bothers to incorporate backtracking at all, I think it's fine. Maybe a problem that team had is how vertical and mountainous they wanted this dungeon to be, because you can't really zip all over the place in a place that's a huge lava cavern when you're also still teaching players how dungeons work, and also Link has 0 items. It really stinks that the first item you get is the grapple hook, because it really just gets more and more annoying the more you use it, like I said earlier. It also really ties into how stupid boring the boss is. First of all, the bosses in this game don't even have their names shown on the screen anymore, which is so sad to me. It gave them that much more gravitas. But this version of Goma sucks. The first phase is literally swinging and jumping, and the second phase takes like 2 seconds when you grab her eye and yank her down. I killed her by grabbing her eye with the grapple hook, which I think just goes to show how awful this is. Overall, Dragon Roost Cavern is mediocre even as a first dungeon, but at least Medley is there. Forbidden Woods is a lot better, I would say. It has a more labyrinthian design. The enemies you encounter here are more creative. Honestly, the whole aesthetic is more creative. All the gimmicks are informed by this being a disgusting, overgrown mutant wood. A lot of doors are blocked by these gross eyeball plants you need to destroy. There are moving thorns that pop out of the floor and make a maze, and you can launch yourself out of these pods and glide across the room. I really like using the Deku Leaf to glide throughout this dungeon, and I also think the boomerang is well utilized in some individual room puzzles. That being said, I do think it could have been used more. The only gimmick I despise in this dungeon are these lifts you have to move by smacking these widgets with air. I found them to be consistently janky and weird to operate. Weirdly enough, I've never had an issue with these things in the past, but this time they decided to be really ornery on camera. They almost ruined this optional puzzle where you climb the room and toss a bomb to unlock a treasure chart too. Stupid. The boss in this dungeon is awesome though. Kalidimos is all about bobbing and weaving while throwing the boomerang as much as possible to knock it down to the floor. It keeps all the fun parts of Baronade from Ocarina of Time while staying distinct by using the upgraded boomerang in a fun and unique way. I also really like how the room is dark and green, and when you knock the boss down and the big flower it's in poofs open, the room gets flushed with a bright blue. Gosh, this boss is so fun. It always makes me paranoid though, because in the past it's Gyorged me by crashing as soon as I beat it. Fortunately, that didn't happen this time, thank God. Forbidden Woods is still incredibly linear and not too complicated, but it's a lot more interesting and enjoyable than its predecessor. So I'd say this is the first good dungeon that the Wind Waker has to offer. That being said, some frustrating mechanics and a rather simple layout hold it back, so the aesthetic and boss fight have to do 90% of the lifting to make this one memorable. Thus, this dungeon is only good instead of great. The Tower of the Gods is, in the story, Link's final test of courage to see if he's hero enough to save Hyrule from Ganon. And I have to say, if that's the case, they really went easy on this kid. If the worst you can do is the most boring block puzzles on Earth, a few BMOS, and their design in this game is really sick by the way, and some risky jumps, then clearly someone else should be in charge because these goddesses are not very creative. Seriously though, not that block puzzles are really great anyways, but the Zelda series has definitely had better and more thought-provoking and more rewarding block puzzles in previous entries. These are definitely the most tedious because you can see the solution pretty immediately, and then it still takes you like 10 minutes to accomplish it. That's not a joke, by the way, because of the freaking water raising level. That's what the whole first half of this dungeon is built around. Block puzzles aside, everything about this first half is fairly mediocre, but it gets stretched out because you can't really do anything while you're swimming, so you have to wait for the water to rise or lower. The second half, focusing around the use of the command melody, is better, but it kind of gets killed by forcing you to do these 3 rooms in a specific order. There's really not a great reason why, with a little tweaking, you couldn't be given the choice to do them in any order. That being said, none of these puzzles are that complicated either, so whatever, I'm just tired already. Although this dungeon does introduce several great enemy types, I wouldn't really say that the combat is exceptional either. All the best enemies that show up here get reused throughout the game anyway, so they were going to show up at some point. The boss, Godin, is especially disappointing to me though, because it's not often we get to straight up fight a weird robot in a Zelda game, and it looks so distinct with its huge nose as well. The use of color is once again excellent, sort of doing a reverse Kali Demos, with the cool colors of the room lighting up whenever he shoots bullets at you. The music is excellent as well, with 2 parts that switch between each other, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The actual fight is pathetically easy, especially as a final trial. Whatever, dude. The Tower of the Gods is really great aesthetically on the whole. It really does feel like a final heroic trial. Lots of gold colors as well as hints of technological prowess make this feel so otherworldly. So while effective as a plot point, as a dungeon, the Tower of the Gods really falls flat. I am very disappointed in this game so far for having this weak of a set of dungeons. I personally don't really count Forsaken Fortress as a dungeon, but I may as well discuss it because enough significant portions of gameplay happen here. The stealth section at the beginning of the game isn't fun at all, but it doesn't go on long enough to get under my skin. Once you return the second time and can storm the fortress, it's a tremendous gameplay payoff that makes it more fun to climb, even if the layout still isn't anything special. I think the main thing that makes Forsaken Fortress worth discussing is the boss fights you take on the second time. Phantom Ganon is basically the same as he was in Ocarina of Time. This time though, he decided to pull this funny trick where he popped up behind me. You're supposed to parry him, but you can just turn around and hit him. Oops. I do like his look this time, I'll give him that, but maybe he should spend some more time at the gym and less at the Goodwill robes aisle. Am I right, or am I right, ladies? The Helmarock King is a very exciting set piece and a good end to the first chapter of the game. The rush up the tower is neat, even though it's way too easy. I really like the camera angle that follows the action. The actual boss battle is kind of mediocre. I think I took at most a half heart of damage, so it's really easy, even compared to some of the other bosses. And it takes way too long to be in a vulnerable state. It has a lot of good attacks, but the fight just goes on forever because they'll just fly away from you and then just float around the arena out of sight until his AI tells him to maybe think about doing something. This fight would have been better if it had some more health, but also did its more aggressive attacks in succession. The fight is still effective because of how much this bird is messed with Link throughout the story, so it's time to really settle the score. I have now said all my thoughts about the Forsaken Fortress. The Earth Temple is, I'm kind of mixed on it. On the one hand, it's just as linear as the other dungeons, and the overuse of the command melody starts to really get annoying as the dungeon goes on. But on the other hand, getting to control Medli does add a bit of fun verticality to the game's usual movement, and using her harp and later on the mirror shield for some fun duo puzzles is kind of clever. The difficulty also rises in this dungeon, as I'd say the enemies are more numerous and difficult to deal with, and that's a really good thing. Add on top of that the reintroduction of neat new versions of some classic Zelda enemies and a really cool dingy atmosphere that actually gets shaken up in the rooms with the shining faces, and you have a dungeon that I guess has more positive factors than negative factors. So I guess this one is pretty good, and truthfully, I also really like having a true partner joining you throughout the dungeoneering adventure. If it had to be anybody, I'm glad it was Medli, because she's just the cutest. Flying and reflection do make for some pretty interesting puzzles that naturally come about from Medli's character design. The boss fight with Jahala blows though. It's pathetically easy, and never evolves. They tried to make it tougher by giving you a smaller window to light him up, but that's not nearly enough. If you go out of your way to get the optional Hurricane Spin attack, you will blast through this fight's offensive phase, so there's very little that's fun about it. Oh, by the way, do you remember when these Zelda games had unique characters instead of enemy gauntlets for mid-bosses? Yeah, me too. Oh well. The Earth Temple is enjoyable for what it is, but it could have been great if it was less linear. Guess what, everybody? My footage for the Wind Temple corrupted, and then I had to upload it and download it again, which may have impacted the footage quality. Wow, that's awesome. Haha. Now I'm gonna be more paranoid when I record footage for the rest of time for the next month. Haha, I hate my car. The Wind Temple is by far the most complex of all the dungeons in this game. It has a large central room with lots of zigzagging across and flying up and down it, which makes for the only time that this game has any real navigation-based puzzle solving in a meaningful way. The path through this dungeon is fairly satisfying to figure out, but there are a lot of elements like the fan and Makar that make it pretty tedious. There's a lot of difficult enemy gauntlets. There were a lot of moments where my magic meter actually drained out, which never happens in this game. I don't know, I just don't vibe with this one. I'll give credit where credit is due. The music is nice and the difficulty was welcomed, but Makar is annoying to control because he's so slow and rigid. The orange color scheme frankly makes me want to puke. The Wizrobes are super annoying in this dungeon, and the boss has a kick-ass song, but the fight sucks. I mean, I almost died to it, I guess, but I didn't. I'd say the hardest part of this is the hookshot's length and not really much else. I mean, what a whatever note to end on. And the worst part is, other than Ganon's Tower, that's it. Those are all the main dungeons. This game may have more than Majora's Mask, but considering the less beefy story of that game and emphasis on side quests, this game kind of falls flat more so in that regard. Like I said in the story discussion, there are some weird parts where it feels like there probably should be a dungeon, like Jaboon's Pearl or maybe a third Sage Temple. Eiji Aonuma has gone on record saying that's basically the case. When people were clamoring for those cut dungeons to be restored in Wind Waker HD, he went on record saying, to be honest, we've already used those two dungeons for other titles after Wind Waker already, so right now technically they don't really exist anymore. We didn't exactly use them as is and implement them into another game. We'd add some of their features to other dungeons, so they're in different dungeons now. And other people have theorized for years that the Fire Mountain and Ice Ring Isles could have been where those former dungeons were as well, but regardless, that ship has obviously sailed, pun entirely intended. As it is, there is an unsatisfying lack of dungeons here, and honestly, I'd say it's the weakest set so far in this retrospective. I said I was pretty disappointed by many elements in each of these dungeons. Even the best one had major shortcomings, and that's a real shame. I think something else that's become clear is that with a couple dungeons straight up cut, the difficulty curve of this game is weird. The first few dungeons are way too easy, the Earth Temple is decently hard, and the Wind Temple is really annoyingly difficult, even though the progression checklist is the most intricate. None of the bosses are remarkable, but some of them are kind of fun. Yeah, whatever. There's been better dungeons of similar calibers in both of the previous games. I feel like I've been down on this game for most of this video, so let's talk about something more positive. You're probably surprised I waited this long to talk about the game's art style, as it's by far the most distinct aspect of this game. Well, you see, I laid out an outline and then just kept the script in that order, so that's why. It's a principle thing. Anyways, this game's unique art style was spearheaded by Yoichi Kotabe, and he contributes his main inspiration for the style to an anime film he worked on. The film is called, and I'm definitely butchering this, Wenpaku Oji no Orochi Taiji, or in English, The Little Prince and the Eight-Headed Dragon. And you can tell from this poster here that it had a very deep influence on the design of Link, which would then go on to inform the rest of the unique aspects to the art style. Most of those unique aspects mainly shine through in the actual game, but I really just want to take a moment to focus on the actual character designs. All the humanoid creatures from Link and all the other Hylians, to the Rito and the Koroks, to all the divine beings in this game, and especially to all the enemies, they all look so distinct from one another. This game may have very intentionally silly characters, but more than anything, I think all these characters are just likable looking. They all have big eyes and distinct expressions. Every Zelda game has crazy memorable characters, but this game really makes all of them look totally unique, and it's just a very heartwarming and enjoyable style to look at. That extends to the game as well, because they really ran with the style and did some awesome stuff with it, and that fact makes me really happy. When the Gamecube and its contemporaries launched, we finally started reaching a point where games could finally actually start looking like the official art drawn for them. It's clear from the amount of little touches present in the visuals of the Wind Waker that the team was incredibly passionate about the art style they were creating. First of all, the characters are all animated spectacularly. There were some characters that definitely stuck out because of their behavior and animation in the N64 games, but some of their animations were very unnatural and weird, and not in like a fun, on-purpose way. Ironically, because of the more cartoony and exaggerated style, these video game characters are now able to move in ways that are a lot more believable and grounded. I mean, for one, if a character flails their arms around, it's less jarring and more adorable now, but I also mean that even something as basic as a character just walking around looks so much more effortless compared to the last two games. Something else that works with this style is the facial expressions. Plenty of characters, especially the main cast, have very expressive eyes, and they have a lot of different facial expressions given to them that make them easier to like and connect with this time around. Link is really the star of the show here. Most of the other characters are really expressive during cutscenes, but Link gets to be expressive all the time. His face is almost constantly doing something new, and it makes him extremely easy to connect with as a playable protagonist and as a regular protagonist. It also helps that a combination of those two factors, the facial textures and the animated expression, helps make cutscenes consistently engaging. Every character uses a lot more body language now, especially in the cutscenes, and all the different animations that are strung together are quick, snappy, and silly. The dialogue boxes definitely slow things down, which is just a problem Zelda has decided to have forever, I guess, but when the characters are moving, they never get boring. Something else I need to discuss is the game's unique cel-shaded approach, which at the time was one of the primary examples of its use in the interactive medium. It was predated by Jet Set Radio by a couple years, and maybe there's another example or two I'm missing, but regardless, Jet Set Radio's flat black shadow approach is the cel shading effect most games go for even to this day to truly imitate hand-drawn animation's appearance. The Wind Waker's approach to— wait a minute, I didn't even explain what cel shading is, did I? Cel shading is essentially when a 3D project renders lit areas, like shadows, as blocks of color instead of using a softer gradient for more realistic shadows. For example, in Jet Set Radio, the outlines of the playable characters are shaded to be fully black, giving the visual illusion that these 3D characters have cartoonish outlines. The blocks of color add a lot to the graffiti focus of that game. However, as I was saying, the Wind Waker's approach stuck out at the time, and it truly sticks out even to this day. It doesn't do the dark outlines, and instead sticks to rendering regions of shadow as solid blocks of slightly different colors. This makes the game feel softer than other games with a similar effect, and when combined with the expressive character models and snappy animations, it really makes this game feel like a Disney movie come to life. Disney movies always have this sort of understood nature of being very easy to sit down and watch for some canned pleasantness. And while that's certainly a critique because most of their films feel identical thematically, and if Raya and the Last Dragon wins Best Animated Picture, I'm going to kill myself. For this game, it really works. This is definitely a change of pace and tone from Ocarina of Time, and especially from Majora's Mask, which makes this approach worth it from a world and story presentation standpoint. The way the world is presented is especially gorgeous in this game. I mean, large patches of green meant to represent a field of grass look really boring, but that's really the only issue I've got with this game's looks. All the other textures look phenomenal, and with the improved power of the Gamecube, environments can have even more detail, and when you're out on the ocean, you can see the silhouettes of far-off islands, which is intriguing. The wind is represented by cartoonish strands that let you know which way the wind direction is blowing, which wouldn't work in any other art style, but here it works perfectly. And the ocean itself is gorgeous. The normal water looks amazing. I painted my nails to look like it, by the way. The simple ocean texture allows for it to be bent and create large waves that that look just as great, and the weather conditions like rain or nighttime look fucking jaw-droppingly beautiful. And there are even more specific little details. People's clothes can jitter in the wind, especially Link's hat. There are all these awesome poofy particle effects for any kind of dust. Just everything about this art style works for me. I'm really impressed with the team for putting all of this style together in such a well thought out, cohesive, and above all original way. People may have complained about the change in art direction in the lead up to this game's release, but even though I'm reviewing the original GameCube version instead of a 1080p Dolphin ROM or even the HD remake for Wii U, which I wish would come to Switch, this game is still proven to be one of the best looking games from its generation. I'd still say it looks better than a lot of games that came out like up to 10 or 15 years after it. Not only that, but this went on to look so good that this has been the most consistently reused art style across the whole Zelda series. This game got 2 direct sequels on the Nintendo DS, and the GBA games Four Swords and the Minish Cap, as well as the GameCube game Four Swords Adventures, and later on the 3DS, the game Triforce Heroes, all used the same toony art style. So, Toon Link haters, who really won, huh? I mean, not to rub it in or anything. I just can't praise the art style of the Wind Waker enough. Something I'll also praise this game for is that it has far better sound design than either of the previous 2 games. Even the louder sounds in this game don't explode the freaking sound barrier anymore. They're all balanced just right. I especially love all the collection sounds. Different rupee values have different little jingles, picking up enemy drops sounds nice, and everything just sounds how it should. I especially love that enemies have weird little voice clips, like how Wizrobe's warp in with this weird beeping, Bubbles laugh at you obnoxiously, and Choo-Choos have this fittingly garbled sound coming out of them. But this big improvement is only a symptom of another great sound-based step forward. The soundtrack of this game is muy excelente, but this is a AAA Zelda game, so that sentence is kind of redundant. What I can say is that the jump to CD quality audio makes the instruments in this game sound leagues better than the N64 games. It also allows all these MIDI tracks to incorporate dynamic elements far more often. This soundtrack was worked on by 4 people. With the rushed development cycle, the team still wanted a high caliber of work, obviously. So while Koji Kondo was still here to compose, he was helped out by Kenta Nagata, Hajime Wakai, and Toru Mingishi. Nagata has worked on a lot of big titles for Nintendo. He worked on Animal Crossing, the Mario Kart series, and even Big Brain Academy. That's a lot of different stuff, and they all sound very different from each other, so good for him for having that much range. Hajime Wakai is someone I'm very familiar with because he's in charge of all the music for the main Pikmin games. I've definitely noticed a lot of his influence in the music of the Wind Waker because the sounds he likes to use are very distinctive and wacky, as are his tracks. Toru Mengishi really stepped up here. From my research, I actually learned one of his first gigs was writing a couple battle themes for Majora's Mask. But for this game, he really got to step up and do a lot of main composition. Around this time, he also started voicing Petey Piranha. Also, nowadays, this guy is the main composer and sound director of the Splatoon series. So this guy's important, memorize him. Okay, now that we've discussed all the composers and their backgrounds, let's actually discuss the music of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. I think the title theme really sets the stage for this game's musical style. Fitting with the cheery visuals, laid-back story, and grand scope, the title screen has this really bouncy and uplifting Celtic song. As I said earlier in this video, the flute part and the stringed instrument part both make up the Earth God's lyric and Wind God's aria, respectively. But this also foreshadows how upbeat the soundtrack will be and how much inspiration it will take from cultures of all kinds. A good example of this is Dragon Roost Island, which has a clear Spanish inspiration I can't get enough of. Forest Haven, on the other hand, feels very Scottish with that bagpipe going off. My other favorite island themes are Windfall Island, which is a heavily redone version of the Kakariko Village theme, but it has enough going for it on its own that I love it. I also love Outside Island's theme, but I already played that one. Unfortunately, that's really all the island themes I have to bring up. Something I kept thinking throughout this game as I visited more and more miscellaneous islands was, why isn't there like a regular island theme? It would have fit so perfectly and made the ocean theme fading out less jarring and awkward. Speaking of the ocean theme, it is far and away probably my very favorite overworld theme out of the ones we've heard so far. Actually, you know what? I'll just own it and say it's my favorite in the series. It takes elements of the classic Zelda overworld theme and makes them fit with the bobbing string section to match you gliding across the waves, and the length of the song with 2 variations of a melody keep it from ever getting stale. It's such a pretty epic and uplifting song to listen to, and even if the Great Sea itself wears out its welcome towards the end, its theme song never does, and I can almost guarantee you it never will. As you can probably imagine then, whenever it gets cut off by the ocean combat theme, it kind of pisses me off. It's fine, definitely not as annoying as Ocarina of Time's combat theme, but I just hate how it cuts off any jovial travel across the ocean, especially when a shark decides to stalk you for multiple squares. They really should have just gone the Pikmin route and added like a drum beat or something. Once again, the normal combat theme isn't super great, especially for how much you have to hear it across the entire game, but it does have a lot more effort put into it to keep it from getting stale. It has more variations going on. The boss themes are mostly all bangers though. Although the mid-bosses all have the same theme, which doesn't bother me, the bosses have seen an upgrade in that they all have their own songs this time. That's so based. My favorite ones are the mid-boss theme, Kalidimos, Godan, Phantom Ganon, the Helmarock King, and Mulgera. Something I have to mention about the normal combat and mid-boss themes is that they incorporate these dynamic sounds that play every time you strike an enemy. It adds some more oomph to your hits on top of the excellent animations, and it's one of my favorite aspects of this soundtrack. In fact, the implementation here was so good, this aspect has been reused to some extent in all the following 3D Zelda games. Although most of the boss themes don't use this feature because they chose to implement dynamic music by way of getting more intense with each phase, Phantom Ganon also has a separate section of the song that kicks in when you begin deflecting his energy tennis balls. This is yet another aspect of the Wind Waker that I cannot praise enough. The dungeon themes, unsurprisingly, are actually what I find the most mediocre out of the selection. I kinda like the Forbidden Woods theme and the Earth Temple, but they're both surpassed by the Tower of the Gods and Forsaken Fortress, and those are even surpassed by the Wind Temple. So yeah, I'll still listen to them though. Let's highlight all the other event themes and miscellaneous songs I haven't gotten to yet. Characters like Link's grandma and the pirates have really great character themes, especially the pirates. I really like the very low-key and somber music that plays when you're inside Hyrule Castle as well. Speaking of Hyrule Castle, the music that plays when you enter the kingdom below the sea, that cutscene score, it's excellent. For the sake of some little bit of brevity, I'll only play that cutscene song, but I have to say that the sheer number created for the game really adds to the story presentation, and I will list my favorites here instead of playing all of them. If anything, take this song as my endorsement to go listen to the entire Wind Waker score for yourself. I haven't even played every incredible song yet because they're all part of the ending sequence of the game. So I guess really the only thing left to talk about is the ending sequence of the game. With the Triforce of Courage reassembled, Link is finally declared a true hero for Hyrule. He even gets his own title, the Hero of Winds. Not bad. However, upon returning to Hyrule, it turns out Zelda's been snatched, so it's time to run down one little corridor, which is a little bit disappointing, and enter Ganon's Tower. Ganon's Tower is definitely the most mid of all the final areas we've been through so far. The first part is just a rerun of gimmicks from the main 4 dungeons with all their problems, plus a boss rush. The visual effect when entering these boss fights is headache-inducing, and so is the redone music for every fight. Plus, none of these bosses were fun enough to fight twice. After this is a maze with Phantom Ganon to get the Arrows of Light and then stop him once and for all. Then one last easy enemy gauntlet before you start the string of final fights. That's it. That's all there is to this dungeon. At least with Majora's Mask, they let you do some optional stuff or just do the final boss. This really should have just been the last climb and then ended if they were gonna pad it out with a bunch of boring fights. Everybody just wants to get to the final boss anyway. This version of Ganondorf hasn't earned a tower climb, he's just earned an awesome fight. Fortunately, this fight is very awesome. The start of the fight is really telling about Ganondorf. He's frustrated with Zelda for wanting the ocean because he really despises how people on the Great Sea worship the old gods that he says destroyed them. This kicks off the Puppet Ganon fight. It's probably the only difficult fight in the game, and it's by far the longest. I really like how it encourages use of a lot of your different items and has you really testing your aim with the light arrows. All the phases have you on the move in different ways. The puppet phase has you constantly trying to throw your boomerang and dodge its punches. The spider phase has you rolling and using the water to see where its butt'll land. By the way, this is the only time in the game the water isn't opaque and actually has reflections. See? Look. Anyways, the snake form is the most on the move itself, and you can either desperately try to snipe it or make it crawl to a stop by spamming bombs. Not that there's a whole lot of consequences for doing that. These 3 different forms also stick out as a result of their different themes. An incredibly hard, fun, and fast-paced fight that this game needed more of, frankly. After this, it's time for the grueling climb up the tower before standing face to face with Ganondorf once again. He explains that the whole reason he strived for the Triforce all this time was that he was jealous of Hyrule's prosperity, while the Gerudos, which I've probably pronounced 2 different ways in the series, I can't remember at this point, had to suffer with the harsh desert conditions. And now he takes Link and Zelda's Triforces in an attempt to wish the past Hyrule back into existence, so things can go back to the way they were. The king reappears and stops him and uses the Triforce to wish that Hyrule be washed away forever. Why? So that the kids might form their own future in their own land. This causes the waves to start pouring in to bury Hyrule, and also causes Ganondorf to snap. If he can't have his hope, nobody can. And it's against this emotionally tense and totally metal backdrop that the final boss begins. The actual fight is easy and won't take very long, but in that short time a lot happens. You'll constantly be parrying Ganondorf, and Zelda even steps in to help out with the light arrows. Ganondorf knocks her out for a short time, but using the mirror shield, Zelda and Link work together to deliver the final blow. I really like that Ganondorf himself is the final boss. Just some old broken guy that refuses to let the future take hold. This is like the brightest final boss area in the series thus far, lighting wise I mean, but there's just such dramatic weight to it, which is accentuated by the intense music. and when Link stabs him in the forehead, all this noise cuts out as Ganondorf turns to stone, causing him to be the final resting place of the Master Sword. With everything taken care of, the king decides to stay and be washed away with Hyrule. He says he's realized that he was like Ganondorf, obsessed with a past that was done and over with. He wants the new generation to do its own thing, and encourages Link and Zelda to go be their own people and discover a new land. This is a good way to push Ocarina of Time's story forward, as the Triforce Trio storyline and even Hyrule itself are put to rest. Saying goodbye to the king is a surprisingly emotional beat for what started out as the most annoying character in the game. After this, we simply get to see that everyone we've met over the course of the game is okay. The pirates, Aril, and Prince Kamali are all here. Medley and Makar are even back now that they don't need to pray for the Master Sword anymore. It's very lighthearted and is the exact kind of note you want a game like this to end on. Each of the games I've covered so far in this retrospective have all really nailed their endings, even if the middle parts of their stories all have their share of problems, and I'm glad the Wind Waker is no different. I've been very down on this game for a lot of this video, but I've really tried to be constructive as well. I feel so bad being negative towards this game because it's still one of my favorites. Sure, there's massive issues with repeated or even missing content, and I can suggest big fixes that would make it more exciting or memorable, but at the end of the day, despite being rushed, this game still has a lot of things going for it. Like, I know the N64 games were on a less powerful console, but this game is still such a presentational leap in so many ways. The characters look more defined, the art style change was for the better, and I love this art direction so much. The music is phenomenal, and the story's themes are the best yet. The setting also probably has to be my favorite just for how different it is. Sure, the islands and sailing are disappointing, the dungeons are mid, and there are plenty of stupid and annoying mechanics, but the truth is that doesn't bother me because of how much polish there already is here. I'd love to see a perfect world where Nintendo redoes this game and fixes all of its issues, but at the end of the day, I don't care. I mean, it's not like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were perfect either. This game rocks, I love it, and I don't care who knows it. I hope at the very least, I did a good job explaining why. Hey, welcome to the end of the video. This one was just as much work as the others, but since I love the Wind Waker so much, it wasn't that much of a burden. I'm really glad to be back to working on Zelda games. My goal is to plow through the last 3 vids and be done by summer at the latest. Something I've also been considering, as you can kind of see here, is that I'm developing some new assets and even rethinking my review structure for this channel. The next 2 videos will be part of the retrospective, but they'll probably look and feel different. It's hard to explain, but I just feel like with my art and music skills becoming bigger and better all the time, I think it's important that, I want the presentation of my channel and videos to reflect that. I guess you'll start to see starting with next time. In the meantime, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter, and subscribe so you can see my next video. Next time on the 3D Zelda retrospective, it's time to stop having fun, okay? We're playing Twilight Princess, which is a serious game for grown-ups only. So get your hairy man legs on, put on your Levi's, do your emo mascara from 2007, and let's game for real.